This year just keeps getting crazier and crazier for us gamers, huh? Just last week, a massive controversy broke out over Helldivers 2, one of the most well-received games of this year, breaking the chain of sloppy AAA releases up till this point. Despite the game's rough few weeks post-launch, the game has solidified itself as one of the heavy hitters of 2024, boasting some of the highest peak concurrent players of any game released this year and outstanding review scores on Steam. So what happened? How did one of the best rated games of the year get review bombed into oblivion over one weekend? This video will be just a short case study on the Helldivers 2 controversy and basically examine a little bit of everything in terms of how this whole situation unfolded. Remember during launch week, many eager players, basically like myself, logged onto the game and we were essentially greeted by a screen prompting us to link our PSN accounts before we could play. Thankfully, the feature was bugged and players were able to basically skip this step and dive straight into the game, assuming that the servers weren't overloaded at the time. This didn't seem like a big problem and the game continued to go from strength to strength over the coming weeks. Fast forward to the 3rd of May, this weekend, and we get hit with this update. Long story short, that little feature that was bugged at launch is now up and running. On top of this, PlayStation or Sony, if you prefer, issued an ultimatum to the player base, forcing them to link their PSN accounts or create one by the 30th of May, or risk being unable to play the game that they paid for. I personally don't really have a problem with linking or creating separate accounts for games, but the issue here is that PSN functionalities are not available in every country. This means that people who bought and happily played the game in a country without PSN services won't be able to play it anymore once the 30th of May rolls around, just like that. This obviously didn't go down too well to the community, as it seems that Sony was basically retroactively forcing gamers to comply with their demands and revoking access to a game that they already paid for if they didn't fall in line and comply with everybody else. On its own, this is already a pretty bad look, but when you take a deep dive into the dodgy history of PlayStation's data protection laws and track record, you'll probably get a better idea of why people were so unhappy about this change and how it was handled and communicated. As I mentioned earlier, Sony hasn't been the best at protecting their data, as shown by the fact that they have had numerous data breaches over the past few years. In fact, one just happened less than a year ago, where the employee data of up to 6,700 plus current and former employees was basically compromised by bad actors. You can take a look at the full list and their track record of data breaches in the link provided, but with that being the case, I wouldn't be super comfortable giving my data to Sony either, considering that, their track record hasn't been the best these few years. What's crazier to me is the fact that Helldivers 2 basically worked completely fine without the inclusion of the PSN account linkage, so forcing the change seemed pretty unusual. I initially thought that maybe this mandate was part of their terms of use policy or privacy policy, but the deeper I dug, the deeper the rabbit hole went. So, terms of use policies are basically things that companies establish so that their product or service doesn't get misused in exchange for rendering that product or service to a customer. I went to look at the PSN terms of use page and saw that PSN is a mandatory requirement for some games. Okay, that's fair enough, but when I booted up the good old Internet Archive, that tells a pretty different story. It shows a page that clearly states that linking a PSN account is optional. So, with that being the case, color me surprised. Who could have guessed that Sony would retroactively go and change the wording on their policies just to make sure that this can't be used against them? Unfortunately for them, nothing's ever really deleted on the internet and their dirty laundry is there for all of us to see. Don't get me wrong, I don't really have a problem with changing of the policies, but doing so in the middle of a controversy without providing clear updates on the decision is just corporate smoke and mirrors and really just poor optics on Sony's part. But wait, it gets worse. Next, another thing I want to talk about is the fact that Sony is the publisher of Helldivers 2 and they are the ones that are pretty much responsible for marketing and selling the game. Arrowhead, on the other hand, is just the developer and they barely have any control on anything outside of game balancing and actually developing the title. They might not even have been aware in terms of how the game is being marketed or sold in the different regions. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because I want to set the record straight before I go into the details of my next point. The other thing which I feel has set a lot of gamers off in terms of why they are so angry about this is the fact that Sony knew that they will be requiring PSN account linkage and creation to allow people to play the game. This is why the game shipped with a PSN account creation linkage prompt when you first booted it up during launch week. So, if that's the case, why in the world would Sony even put the game up for sale in countries which do not have PSN access? Think about it, you sell the game to people who can't create accounts or link accounts without a VPN, and then retroactively go back to those same people who probably spend loads of time or money on the game and tell them that, hey, you just can't play anymore. How did they think that this was going to go over? It was a horrendous idea to begin with, and the fact that Sony even tried to enforce this policy is crazy to me. Next, Sony started delisting the game from the same countries which do not have PSN support after the announcement was made on the 3rd of May. Effectively, this told all the people who bought the game in those countries that they just can't play the game anymore and that they basically should have lived somewhere else if they wanted to play Helldivers with their friends. I don't even have any words for this. This just reeks of corporate delusion where they try to strong arm any decision through, even though it could decimate the community and turn them against you. And turn it did. With all of this in mind, let's take a look at the absolute firestorm that the community threw at the game over the next few hours. The game went from being one of the highest rated games on Steam to being marked as overwhelmingly negative within just 24 hours. Just take a look at the Steam review charts, they tell the story better than I can. Fed up by this, many people have also requested refunds from Steam. Just take a look at Reddit, Steam or Twitter during that weekend and you will see the community up in arms over this decision by Sony. The community was then galvanized even further into review bombing the game when a rogue Arrowhead community manager who essentially told them to negatively review the game as much as possible to give ammunition to Arrowhead to use against Sony. I am not sure what you think about this community manager specifically, but I've got to give props for sticking to your guns and rallying the community in a time of need. The pressure mounted so quickly that publications all around the world started covering the story and placed even more scrutiny on Sony and their mandate. After a few days of radio silence by Sony, they finally came out with this statement. You can pause the video to read about it, but it's just corporate speak claiming that they are trying to do better and listen to the community, ultimately saying that they are backtracking on the mandate that was issued a few days ago. This is a great outcome for the community, where divers from all across the globe can continue sinking time into the game that they love, and Sony was able to at least save some of its face. Even though that is the case, I also want to point out that Sony backtracked on this decision not because they wanted to, but because of the record caused by the community being too much for them to handle. Let's not forget that during the time and that weekend, before the rollback was announced, Sony tried to stonewall the community and push this mandate through. They delisted the game from Steam marketplaces in countries without PSN services, and also continued to retroactively change the wording on their PSN policy pages all around the globe while the controversy raged on. Only when the pressure got to a breaking point did Sony finally throw in the towel and backtrack on the PSN mandate, and the community celebrated their win over the corporate menace. Overall, I like to think of this as a case study of how powerful the community can be when we all act together. And it really gives me hope that the next time corporations try to pull their sneaky nonsense, we'll all be ready to push back equally hard, no matter the form that takes.